Martin Van Buren.
The presidency of Martin Van Buren began on March 4, 1837, when Martin Van Buren was inaugurated as President of the United States, and ended on March 4, 1841. Van Buren, the incumbent vice president and chosen successor of President Andrew Jackson, took office as the 8th United States President after defeating multiple Whig Party candidates in the 1836 presidential election. A member of the Democratic Party, Van Buren's presidency ended following his defeat by Whig candidate William Henry Harrison in the 1840 presidential election. The central issue facing President Van Buren was the Panic of 1837, a sustained economic downturn that began just weeks into his presidency. Van Buren opposed any direct federal government intervention and cut back federal spending to maintain a balanced budget. He also presided over the establishment of the independent Treasury system, a series of government vaults that replaced banks as the repository of federal funds. Van Buren continued the Indian removal policies of the Jackson administration, as thousands of Native Americans were resettled west of the Mississippi River during his presidency. He sought to avoid major tensions over slavery, rejecting the possibility of annexing Texas and appealing the case of United States vs. the Amistad to the Supreme Court. In foreign affairs, Van Buren avoided war with Britain despite several incidents, including the bloodless Aroostook War and the Caroline Affair. Van Buren's inability to deal effectively with the economic crisis, combined with the growing political strength of the opposition Whigs, led to his defeat in the 1840 presidential election. His four-year presidency was marked as much by failure and criticism as by success and popular acclaim, and his presidency is considered average, at best, by historians. His most lasting achievement was as a political organizer who built the modern Democratic Party and guided it to dominance in the new second-party system.
William Henry Harrison.
William Henry Harrison, an American military officer and politician, was the 9th President of the United States, the oldest president to be elected at the time. On his 32nd day, he became the first to die in office, serving the shortest tenure in U.S. presidential history. When he arrived in Washington in February 1841, Harrison let Daniel Webster edit his inaugural address, ornate with classical allusions. Webster obtained some deletions, boasting in a jolly fashion that he had killed 17 Roman proconsuls as dead as smelts, every one of them. Webster had reason to be pleased, for while Harrison was nationalistic in his outlook, he emphasized in his inaugural that he would be obedient to the will of the people as expressed through Congress. But before he had been in office a month, he caught a cold that developed into pneumonia. On April 4, 1841, he died, the first president to die in office, and with him died the Whig program. His last words were to his attending doctor, though assumed to be directed at Vice President John Tyler. "Sir, I wish you to understand the true principles of the government. I wish them carried out. I ask nothing more."
John Tyler.
The presidency of John Tyler began on April 4, 1841, when John Tyler became President of the United States upon the death of President William Henry Harrison, and ended on March 4, 1845. He had been Vice President of the United States for only 31 days when he assumed the presidency. The 10th United States President, he was the first to succeed to the office intra-term without being elected to it. To forestall constitutional uncertainty, Tyler took the presidential oath of office on April 6, moved into the White House, and assumed full presidential powers, a precedent that would govern future extraordinary successions and eventually become codified in the 25th Amendment. Although nominated for the vice presidency on the Whig Party ticket, Tyler differed from his party on several issues. A strict constructionist, Tyler found much of the Whig platform unconstitutional, and he vetoed several bills favored by party leader Henry Clay. Among the bills vetoed by Tyler was a measure to re-establish a national bank. In response to these vetoes, most of Tyler's cabinet resigned, and Whig congressmen expelled Tyler from the party. A resolution calling for his impeachment was introduced in the House, though it was later defeated. Despite his disagreements with Congress, Tyler did sign the Tariff of 1842, which provided needed revenue to a government still dealing with the effects of the Panic of 1837. The USS Princeton disaster of 1844 occurred on February 28 aboard the newly built USS Princeton when one of the ship's long guns, the Peacemaker, then the world's longest naval gun, exploded during a display of the ship. Among the dead were Secretary of State Abel Upshur, Secretary of the Navy Thomas Gilmer, and 7 other people, including David Gardner, father of Julia Gardner, the fiancée of President John Tyler. 20 people were injured as well. President Tyler survived the disaster because he was below decks. On March 1, 1845, 3 days before turning the presidency over to Polk, Tyler signed a Texas annexation bill into law, and Texas would be admitted as a state in the first year of Polk's presidency. Tyler's presidency has provoked highly divided responses, but he is generally held in low esteem by historians. Some historians and commentators have praised Tyler's foreign policy, personal conduct, and the precedent he set with regards to presidential succession.
James K. Polk.
The presidency of James K. Polk began on March 4, 1845, when James K. Polk was inaugurated as President of the United States, and ended on March 4, 1849. He was a Democrat, and assumed office after defeating Whig Henry Clay in the 1844 presidential election. Polk left office after 1 term, fulfilling a campaign pledge he made in 1844, and he was succeeded by Whig Zachary Taylor. A close ally of Andrew Jackson, Polk's presidency reflected his adherence to the ideals of Jacksonian democracy and manifest destiny. Polk was the last strong pre-Civil War president, having met during his 4 years in office every major domestic and foreign policy goal set during his campaign and the transition to his administration. Polk's presidency was particularly influential in U.S. foreign policy, and his presidency saw the last major expansions of the contiguous United States. When Mexico rejected the U.S. annexation of Texas, Polk achieved a sweeping victory in the Mexican-American War, which resulted in the cession by Mexico of nearly the whole of what is now the American Southwest. He threatened war with the United Kingdom over control of the Oregon Country, eventually reaching an agreement in which both nations agreed to partition the region at the 49th parallel. Polk also accomplished his goals in domestic policy. He ensured a substantial reduction of tariff rates by replacing the black tariff with the Walker Tariff of 1846, which pleased the less industrialized states of his native South by rendering less expensive both imported and, through competition, domestic goods. Additionally, he built an independent treasury system that lasted until 1913, oversaw the opening of the U.S. Naval Academy and of the Smithsonian Institution, the groundbreaking for the Washington Monument, and the issuance of the first United States postage stamp. Polk did not closely involve himself in the 1848 presidential election, but his actions strongly affected the race. General Zachary Taylor, who had served in the Mexican-American War, won the Whig presidential nomination and defeated Polk's preferred candidate, Democratic Senator Lewis Cass. Scholars have ranked Polk favorably on lists of greatest presidents for his ability to promote, obtain support for, and achieve all of the major items on his presidential agenda. However, he has also been criticized for leading the country into war against Mexico and for exacerbating sectional divides. Polk has been called the least known consequential president of the United States.
Zachary Taylor.
In 1848, General Zachary Taylor was nominated by the Whigs to run for president with Millard Fillmore as his running mate. He did not learn about his nomination until weeks later. He was challenged by Democrat Lewis Cass. The main campaign issue was whether to ban or allow slavery in territories captured during the Mexican War. Taylor, a dedicated supporter of the Union, did not express an opinion, while Cass supported the idea of allowing residents of each state to decide. Former President Martin Van Buren, leader of the Free Soil Abolitionist Party, entered the race and took votes from Cass, allowing Taylor to win with 163 of 290 electoral votes. Taylor served as president from March 5, 1849, until July 9, 1850. During his administration, the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty was made between the U.S. and Great Britain. The agreement stated that canals across Central America were to be neutral, and outlawed the colonization in Central America. It stood until 1901. Taylor himself was a slave owner and thus, for a period of time, he had significant support from the South. He was, however, dedicated to preserving the Union and believed that the best way to ensure the continuity of the Union was to avoid extending the practice of enslavement into the territories. He disagreed with Congress over the question of whether California should be admitted to the Union as a free state. His successor Millard Fillmore was more sympathetic to the Southern cause. By 1850, Taylor started suggesting he would be willing to take up arms to preserve the Union. The Compromise of 1850 was introduced by Henry Clay. According to History.com, the compromise traded California's admission to the Union with the abolition of the slave trade in Washington, D.C., supported by abolitionists, and a strong fugitive slave law, supported by Southerners, while allowing New Mexico and Utah to be established as territories. Taylor was unimpressed by the compromise and showed signs that he might veto it. On a hot day in July, Taylor ate only raw vegetables, cherries, and milk. He contracted gastroenteritis soon after, along with violent cramps. He died on July 8, 1850, at the White House, and Vice President Millard Fillmore was sworn in as president the next day. Some believed that Taylor might have been assassinated by poison. His body was exhumed in 1991, and testing concluded there were no signs of arsenic present in his remains, though it's possible that other poisons could have caused his death. Zachary Taylor was not known for his education and he had no political background. He was elected solely on his reputation as a war hero. As such, his short time in office was not one full of major accomplishments outside of the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. However, if Taylor had lived and in fact vetoed the Compromise of 1850, the events of the mid-19th century would have been very different.
Millard Fillmore.
The presidency of Millard Fillmore began on July 9, 1850, when Millard Fillmore became President of the United States upon the death of Zachary Taylor, and ended on March 4, 1853. Fillmore had been Vice President of the United States for 1 year, 4 months when he became the 13th United States President. Fillmore was the second president to succeed to the office without being elected to it, after John Tyler, as well as the last Whig president. Fillmore was succeeded by Democrat Franklin Pierce. Upon taking office, Fillmore dismissed Taylor's cabinet and pursued a new policy with regards to the territory acquired in the Mexican-American War. He supported the efforts of Senators Henry Clay and Stephen A. Douglas, who crafted and passed the Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850 temporarily settled the status of slavery in the lands acquired as a result of the Mexican-American War, and led to a brief truce in the political battle between slave and free states. A controversial part of the compromise was the Fugitive Slave Act, which expedited the return of escaped slaves to those who claimed ownership. Fillmore felt himself duty-bound to enforce it, but his support of the policy damaged his popularity and split both the Whig Party and the nation. In foreign policy, Fillmore launched the Perry Expedition to open trade in Japan, moved to block the French annexation of Hawaii, and avoided war with Spain in the aftermath of Narciso Lopez's filibuster expeditions to Cuba. Fillmore somewhat reluctantly sought his party's nomination for a full term, but the split between supporters of Fillmore and Secretary of State Daniel Webster led to the nomination of General Winfield Scott at the 1852 Whig National Convention. Pierce defeated Scott by a wide margin in the general election. Though some analysts praise various aspects of his presidency, Fillmore is generally ranked as a below-average president in polls of historians and political scientists.
Franklin Pierce.
The presidency of Franklin Pierce began on March 4, 1853, when Franklin Pierce was inaugurated as President of the United States, and ended on March 4, 1857. Pierce, a Democrat from New Hampshire, took office as the 14th United States President after routing Whig Party nominee Winfield Scott in the 1852 presidential election. Seen by fellow Democrats as pleasant and accommodating to all the party's factions, Pierce, then a little-known politician, won the presidential nomination on the 49th ballot of the 1852 Democratic National Convention. Pierce vetoed funding for internal improvements, called for a lower tariff, and vigorously enforced the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Influenced by the Young America expansionist movement, the Pierce administration completed the Gadsden land purchase from Mexico, clashed with Britain in Central America, and led a failed attempt to acquire Cuba from Spain. Pierce's administration was severely criticized after several of his diplomats issued the Ostend Manifesto, which called for the annexation of Cuba, by force if necessary. His popularity in the northern free states declined sharply after he supported the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act, which nullified the Missouri Compromise. Passage of the act led directly to a long and violent conflict over the expansion of slavery in the American West. In the wake of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Whig Party fell apart, and the Democratic Party was severely weakened. With the Whig Party's breakup, two new major parties emerged in the Nativist American Party and the anti-slavery Republican Party. Pierce actively sought renomination at the 1856 Democratic National Convention, but he was defeated by James Buchanan, who had served as Pierce's ambassador to Britain. Buchanan went on to win the 1856 presidential election, defeating the nominees of the American Party and the Republican Party. Pierce is viewed by presidential historians as an inept chief executive, whose failure to stem the nation's inter-sectional conflict accelerated the course towards civil war. He is generally ranked as one of the worst presidents in the country's history.
James Buchanan.
The presidency of James Buchanan began on March 4, 1857, when James Buchanan was inaugurated as President of the United States, and ended on March 4, 1861. Buchanan, a Democrat from Pennsylvania, took office as the 15th United States President after defeating former President Millard Fillmore of the American Party, and John C. Fremont of the Republican Party in the 1856 presidential election. Buchanan was nominated by the Democratic Party at its 1856 convention, where he defeated both the incumbent President Franklin Pierce and Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas. Despite his long experience in government, Buchanan was unable to calm the growing sectional crisis that would divide the nation at the close of his term. Prior to taking office, Buchanan lobbied the Supreme Court to issue a broad ruling in Dred Scott v. Sandford. Though Buchanan hoped that the court's ruling would end the dispute over slavery in the territories, Buchanan's support of the ruling deeply alienated many Northerners. Buchanan also joined with Southern leaders in attempting to gain the admission of Kansas to the Union as a slave state under the Lecompton Constitution. In the midst of the growing chasm between slave states and free states, the Panic of 1857 struck the nation, causing widespread business failures and high unemployment. Tensions over slavery continued to the end of Buchanan's term. Buchanan had promised in his inaugural address to serve just one term, and with the ongoing national turmoil over slavery, no one asked him to rescind his pledge. Republican nominee Abraham Lincoln, running on a platform devoted to keeping slavery out of all Western territories, defeated the splintered Democratic Party and Constitutional Union candidate John Bell to win the 1860 election. In response to Lincoln's victory, 7 Southern states declared their secession from the Union. Buchanan refused to confront the seceded states with military force, but retained control of Fort Sumter. The secession crisis culminated in outbreak of the American Civil War shortly after Buchanan left office. Many consider him as the worst president in American history, for during his administration, the Union broke apart, and when he left office, the Civil War ensued.